Welcome, everybody. My name is Greg Peterson. I am the chairman of the Memorial Committee of the Jamestown Bar Association, and I'd like to convene a special session of that committee to celebrate the life of Charles Edward Ed Fagan. And the order of the day will be, I will read the obituary. I will then make available, open the opportunity for anybody for comments. And then the transcript, which Jerry Leneke has agreed, even though in retirement, to do, and he will then provide it to the family. So with that, but before we get started, I just want to pause and recognize the passing of somebody who's not a member of the Bar Association, but was intimately involved with the Bar Association, and that is Thomas Muldowney. Thomas Muldowney, stenographer extraordinaire, died at age 86 on November 16th, 2023, and he had worked for 36 years on a job he loved the most, which was being a court reporter for family court, county court, and the New York State Supreme Court. And for those who are listening to this and want to know more about the life and time of stenographers with the Bar Association, had an event a few years ago with Mr. Keating, Mr. Muldowney, and Mr. Leneke here, which was hilarious. So with that, I just want to acknowledge that for the record. Charles Edward Ed Fagan, 77, died at his home in Bradenton, Florida on November 18th, 2023, after a short but brave battle with cancer. Ed was born September 28th, 1946, in Jamestown, New York, the son of William L. and Mildred Kofod Fagan. He grew up in the village of Lakewood and graduated from Southwestern Central School in 1964. He continued his education at the University of Colorado at Boulder and Columbia Law School in New York. He was admitted to the bar in 1974 and practiced law for a brief time in New York City, returning to Jamestown in 1976 when he established a law office with Lanny R. Sheffield, joining that practice for a few years. He served as public defender of Chautauqua County in the 1970s and early 1980s, and was an alternate delegate to the Democratic National Convention from New York in 1980. He returned to private practice and retired in 2011. He also served as a board member and acting executive director of the Lucille Ball Desi Arnaz Center. He is survived by his children, Christopher Fagan of Montana, Joanna Fagan Sample, thank you, Joanna, for being with us today, together with Jason of Jamestown, William Edward Eddie Fagan of Florida, and Madison Fagan Fahrenholt of Maryland. At the light of his life, his granddaughter, Abigail Fahrenholt of Maryland, his sister Marilyn Gruhl, and many nieces and nephews. At this time, I'd like to open up the mic, if you will, to anybody, members of the Jamestown Bar Association, who would like to share a remembrance. And I know Chuck D'Angelo, front and center. Would you like to lead?
In my old age, I make note cards now. So that special person sitting over there, I'll mention her again in a couple of minutes, Joe Fagan Sample, helped me. I said, could you do me a favor? I want to see all of Dad's reported cases. 94 reported cases. It doesn't count the unreported cases. At the state Supreme Court level, Fourth Department, Court of Appeals, Western District of New York, Western District of Pennsylvania, Second Circuit, 4 cases he litigated in the Second Circuit, which those of us who practice law, I've yet to argue a case in the Second Circuit. Just isn't, you don't get those opportunities. Court of Claims. What kind of work did he do? And you know, in this day and age, most of us try to get our niche and stay in our lane. It's safer that way because trying to be knowledgeable in all areas of law is difficult at best. Not Ed. He did a wide range of cases. Infant settlements, estates, federal civil rights cases in the federal court, prisoner right cases in federal court, labor and employment cases. I didn't know that, otherwise I would have told him to stay out of my area, but now I found out. Criminal law, of course, corporate law and business litigation. He had wrongful arrest cases, a couple of difficult ones. He brought actions to pierce the corporate veil and some personal business litigation. He brought a replevant action, defended a gay couple's right to adopt, did personal injury. Speaking of niches, everybody practicing back in the day knew that one of the best niches he had was the oil and gas lease niche. Very, very expert in that area. And everybody, he was the go-to guy for the lawyers. Estate litigation, construction litigation, bank litigation, insurance litigation, school law cases, defamation cases, did farm litigation, corporate dissolutions, divorces, litigated with the DEC, brought a gag order case like they're talking about in the Trump case, prisoner rights cases, medical malpractice, business organization. He also set up businesses, not just litigated. And of course, he got involved in estate litigation. To know Ed was to love him, but I got to describe him accurately. Anyway, and he's smiling at me right now. Boy, was he hard-nosed. I used to tell people that litigating with or against Ed was like wrestling a Coke machine. You always felt like you could get a hold of it, but you couldn't move it. Super, super smart. And I have the descendant of Ed Fagan in my office, and Joe Fagan Sample. Now I know she had a good gene pool with her mom too, but let me tell you, I got a glowing example of how smart Ed Fagan is every day when I work with Joe. Very articulate. He never had a problem expressing, and he could produce motions in a moment. One case I was working on I think it was a co-defendant in case, and he called to check, and I don't think it was Joe at the time. I think it was another legal assistant. And he said, where's Chuck's papers? And the secretary, legal assistant, tried to defend me by saying, well, it's taken him longer than he expected. And Ed's famous comment was, D'Angelo always gets mental constipation when he has to write a motion. He was never afraid to argue any case. He was one of those guys, and the other example was John Goodell back in the day. They weren't afraid to take on authority. And, you know, there's not a lot of lawyers that want to bring Article 78s against the government, the crown. Ed Fagan wasn't afraid of that. Among the bar, everybody knew he was a good criminal and civil litigator, and he was highly regarded in that regard. In one day, I had to argue a blood test case in county court. What happened was the WCA hospital was taking blood samples after a DWI arrest, but they weren't, there was no doctor in supervision. But they said that there was nurse practitioners, et cetera, in the area in the emergency room, so that sufficed for certification purposes. Well, all the defense lawyers got wind of it, that it was just a nurse taking blood and there was nobody overseeing it. We thought that was a good angle to try to knock out, would have been probably hundreds of cases. So there was like 10 of us arguing that appeal. They consolidated the appeals. We're all going to be heard one day at county court. Judge Leetown Adams was the judge. Ed Fagan gets up. First of all, a couple other lawyers made their argument. And then Ed Fagan gets up, and he makes a great argument. Has it nailed, explains the connection, why the doctor should have been there, what the certification requirements, why it requires by certification that they be there, et cetera. Great argument. Judge Adams says, I approach the bench to do my argument. Judge Adams says, and Mr. D'Angelo, you may go ahead. And I said, Your Honor, what he said. And Judge Adams said, just a minute. And he passes me a note. And the note said, that's the best argument you've ever made. Let me tell you about the other side of Ed Fagan. As hard as he fought for his clients, he equally loved that hard too. His children, I knew him on a very personal basis. His children were the center of his life. And I have one of those people that I'm with every working day. Joe was the light of his life. His family, his sisters were very important to him. And frankly, he defined himself by who he was, by his heritage. And I had to ask Joe, I said, where'd that come from? Well, it turns out his mom, Nana, as Joe calls her, was a Scandinavian woman who found herself widowed with 3 children, Ed included. She made sure Ed grew up with a love of his heritage, Danish and Irish. Ed came from a mother who had to do it all by herself, and Ed was taught real early on about taking care of yourself and making your own way. I also, along the way, got a firsthand look at Ed's friendships. He had a lot of groups that he would have lunches with, et cetera, at the town club and various breakfast places. I remember him meeting with Dr. Barone in the Democratic group. It was back in the day before Friendlies. It was before Friendlies was Friendlies. I'm not even going to mention the name of that place anymore, the prior name. He also grew up with, I call them the big 3, Richard Fessenden, they nicknamed him Fuzzy, Jerry Tadero, I got it right, Jerry, and Ed Burke. I still bump into Ed Burke, who was very close with Ed at the Buffalo Bills games. They were attached at the hip growing up, and as you would imagine, one of the favorite places when Ed was growing up was the surf club. Everybody was hanging out at the surf club. About 2 years ago, my friend Ed stopped by to see me, and he was carrying a bag. He put it aside while he was talking to me, and I'm sitting at my desk, and we got caught up on each other's life. As you may have sensed this morning, Ed and I had a great friendship, but it was not without its bumps in the road. He and I would go at it pretty good too, basically because I treated him like a brother and he treated me like a brother, and we said whatever was on our mind, we said to each other. That never, ever separated us. No matter as much as we would fight with each other, we always came to the end loving each other. Well, like I said 2 years ago, that was, before I get there, that was real important to me that I could maintain my friendship with Ed. As the meeting that day was winding down, he reaches over and said words to this effect. He gets the bag out. And he wanted to give me something. And the way he expressed it was, you're important to me. This was one of the best things I've ever done, had fun with. And I wanted to give it to you because I wanted you to know how much I appreciate our friendship. I don't need the notes anymore. He had gone to a Yankees baseball camp for 2 weeks. So the first week you get out there, you play baseball, they teach you, hit balls to you, et cetera. Then the second week you play with the old timers. The likes of, and he gave me the book with his autographs, by the way, Ed Fagan, New York Yankees Fantasy Camp, November 2005. And then he had got autographs from Whitey Ford, Fritz Peterson, Bobby Mercer, Tommy John. For a Yankee fan, it doesn't get any better than he said, I want you to have this book. And I said, Ed, you don't have to give me that book. He says, no, I want you to have it. I said, thank you, because it means a lot to me. I'm a Yankee baseball card guy, and I appreciated the autographs. I don't have a lot of autographs, so I thanked him. He also gave me his tickets that they gave him to go to the Yankees game as a keepsake. And then he pulled out the best thing ever. So now he's going to play baseball the second week, and they play 2-3 games against these old timers. And you get to pick out your uniform and you get to pick out your number. Well, anybody who knows baseball knows the Babe is number 3. This is what Ed Fagan gave me. He gave me his baseball uniform from fantasy camp. He was the Babe at fantasy camp. And of course, the pants. So, yes, I had a very special relationship with Ed. Not wanting to go make this be a waste, I thought I would dress up in it one night and show my wife, put it on, open the door. I said, go sit on the couch. Put it on, open the door. I said, and she goes, wasn't working for me. You know, in the bar, as far as lawyers lawyering go, you'd be hard pressed to find a lawyer as good as the Ed Fagans and the Paul Webbs of the world, not to mention the other lawyers that we've all had experience to work with. But in the litigation realm, boy, oh boy, those guys were tough cookies, and there wasn't anybody in the Buffalo bar that didn't know it. Thank you, Greg, for this opportunity to talk about my good friend, Ed.
Thank you.
John Samuelson. It was a shock to see Ed's obituary in the paper. I always think of him as being so much younger, and in actuality, we are 4 months apart in age. So that's why I was there anyway. Ed and I began practice in Chautauqua County at the same time, 1975. He became the public defender, and I was an assistant public defender. I also began a private practice at that time. And we continued in that way until the early 80s, when we both began just purely private practice. He didn't practice mainly in the areas that I did. I was doing a lot of real estate, a lot of matrimonial, domestic relations law, and family law, and that was not Ed's area of practice. We did see each other quite often. I was out on his boat on Chautauqua Lake. I enjoyed that. He occasionally had large parties with about 100 people there or so, which were very enjoyable. And I know he celebrated his Irish heritage. He had a movie over at the Civic Center with an Irish theme to it that invited a great number of people to. He came over and played poker with our poker group periodically. But for the most part, I didn't see him in court because we didn't do the same type of law. But that changed in 1997 when he became the counsel on a matrimonial case that was going on, had started, and he was the substitute counsel on that case. And it went on from 1997 to 1999. And in that case, we had 24 days of trial and over 90 court appearances. And I can tell you, you get to know the measure of a man and counsel in the course of matrimonial trial anyway, which usually can be very stressful, especially if you have clients that are very antagonistic. We had 3 different judges, but in 24 days of trial, plus the depositions and everything, and all the discovery and all the other back and forth that goes on, thousands of pages of documents, he was always a gentleman, and he was fiercely combative as far as his client was concerned, and represented him admirably. But I never had that feeling in any way, shape, or form that he wasn't going by the book, that he wasn't handling things properly as an attorney, and it was a very difficult time. I mean, it devoured both of our practices to a large extent for that 2-year period. We were just overcome by it, and we couldn't get ourselves out of it. But We went through that case. The final decision I brought with me, it was 60 pages, single-spaced, and then we went up and did appeals after that. And throughout all that procedure, he was a thorough gentleman. I could always talk with him. We could always talk together to try to resolve problems. He was the thorough attorney. And if there would have been anyone else there, somebody either that wasn't competent or somebody that was belligerent or somebody who just could not control the process or control his client, it would have been a disaster. Not that it wasn't close to a disaster in all other respects anyway, but I believe that that may have been the longest trial in Chautauqua County. I mean, I don't think there's been one that's been longer than 24 days. And I really learned to appreciate him. As I say, I got to know him personally. I went out on his boat. We played poker together. We did a number of other social activities together. I always enjoyed his company. So I enjoyed his company. And I respected him and enjoyed him as an attorney. And when I saw this obituary in the paper, I was shocked and saddened, and I will miss him. So even though I hadn't seen him that often, I always knew he was there, and he was a great, great man, and I appreciate knowing him.
Greg Edwards, Jamestown. I'm pleased, Greg, that you continue to have these events. I'm thankful for the timing of the speakers because I can ride on the coattails of two lawyers that I certainly admire and appreciate, and it was appropriate. I'm here today in a blue blazer. It's in honor of Ed's uniform. Those that practiced with him knew invariably he'd have one on. I cannot match that style because his was always tailored and double-breasted. And that was what I came to understand as John, you just articulated. His approach was very specific and right down to his attire. So he came in uniform. Chuck, as you mentioned, it cannot be overstated how smart Ed was, and never so evident as his quickness in oral argument. I had the pleasure as an assistant public defender of spending lots of Mondays in Mayville listening to men and women I came to admire for their capacity. I spent a lot of time around the courtroom, and I had the distinct pleasure of watching Ed in action. And there wasn't anyone that could match his quickness of thought and, to your point, Chuck, as well, his capacity to enunciate precisely what it was he was trying to communicate with great effect. And that was an art form that you got a chance to observe when Ed was on his best. He was also very tough. I'm thrilled that, John, you went in front of me because an example of that toughness I got to experience because the case that John referred to, I was the counsel prior to Ed with the opposing client. My experience in that case was challenging. Every action that I brought in the court was ruled against by the judge handling that case. It was a situation where it took the trial capacity of someone like Ed Fagan to go up against John, one of the best trial lawyers out there, John, always have been. And so I called Ed. I said, Ed, I've got a tough case. I said, I don't have the resources to take this case on. It's going to go all the way to not only trial, but possibly beyond. Fortunately, the clients had some resources. You couldn't do 24 days in appeals and everything else without some resources, number one, to fight over, which was unfortunate. But to do that, so he took it on. And I experienced what I believe every lawyer and what every doctor ought to have to experience, and that is sitting in a witness chair and being cross-examined by John and direct examined by Ed as part of the case. And I can't remember what pieces of the case they were examining me on, but I have a vivid recollection of, number one, not wanting to be there, and number two, just fighting for my life up there to try and get through the exam and cross-exam. None of it mean-spirited or otherwise, but just, I think, practitioners of the art form of lawyering and doctoring ought to experience that as well. One of the things that hasn't been mentioned yet about Ed was that he was generous. He called me in on an oil and gas case to try and settle it because he and opposing counsel just could not communicate and couldn't get it done. And we walked through the nature of the case, the status of where it was in litigation, and I agreed to step in to see if I could assist in getting it done. Ed did not pick me because of my legal prowess. He picked me because I had a relationship with opposing counsel and thought that I might be able to, he thought I might be able to bring it to a reasonable conclusion, which fortunately I was able to do that. And Ed said, I want to pay you. And I said, that's out of the question. That wasn't the reason I took the case. It was, you're a fellow lawyer, you're a friend, and I felt I could be helpful to you in that. And he appropriately argued, but then relented. I think of Ed often because the painting he gave me still hangs in my house. And it is a beautiful painting and speaks to his generosity. Ed and I have unusual connections in that he owned a home on Findlay Lake. My parents' family owned a cottage on Findlay Lake. And so I'd regularly see him on the beautiful deck that he added to that property early on in his ownership. And so we would interact that way. But what I want to relate today is that Findlay Lake connection came to the forefront later on. And that is that for a time I was a certified lay pastor, and the pastor in Findlay Lake asked me to stand in for him one Sunday. And as these life experiences go, I have two memories from that. One of them was, it was probably the worst sermon I ever attempted to deliver. I was distracted, it didn't flow, and I was frustrated by that, but at that stage of the game, you're in it and you finish it. In about 3/4, I had noticed that Ed was in church. I didn't know Ed to be a church-going guy. But he was in church that day. About 3/4 of the way through, he got up and left. And I understood appropriately why. But knowing where he lives and knowing Ed, afterwards I drove to his home on Findlay Lake and talked to him. And he didn't get up and leave because my sermon was so terrible. He got up and left because he was in the midst of divorce. And his heart hurt. His heart especially was hurt for his children and the impact that divorce was having on his children. I think that speaks to your comments, Chuck, about where his true core was, where his heart was. So I have fond memories of Ed for who he was as a lawyer, his commitment to his family, and he'll be missed but not forgotten.
Hello, my name is Joanna, and I'm a Fagan. Everybody's talked about my dad and his generosity and who he was, and that very much who he was, but I think you also have to remember his sense of humor when you talk about him, which, as I'm sure Chuck is realizing, was very much genetic and has been passed down. Mr. Samuelson mentioned his boat on Chautauqua Lake, which was called Crime Pays, which is very fitting for an attorney and more fitting for my father because, yeah, he definitely had a wicked sense of humor. In fact, when I first started working for him, he thought it would be hilarious to haze me by making me sort autopsy photos. So that was my introduction to working with him, and I was there for about 8 years. And I definitely learned a lot. I learned a lot about the law. I learned a lot about him. Growing up, I did kind of have an interesting, somewhat difficult relationship with him because my parents also got divorced when I was very young. So working with him definitely forged a bond. We got to know each other as adults. So I will always be very, very thankful for that time. And he was tough, and he saw it as his duty to do the best job he could for his clients. I mean, he had some nasty cases, murder cases and rape cases, and he did the best he could because that was his duty as an attorney. Those were his clients, and he fought for them. And that's how he, treated all of his clients. Sometimes to the detriment of, the feeling towards him in this town. Growing up with Ed Fagan as your father in this town was interesting because, is Ed Fagan your father was a very loaded question. You didn't know what to say. It was always yes, and sometimes, you got an earful. But, he kind of just took that and rolled with it because, again, he was doing his best job for somebody. If he made the other party mad, that was good. And yeah, he wasn't afraid to, go after municipalities, agencies. He just, loved the fight. He loved the law, and he did it all the way up until he retired. And, it's funny about, people were talking about his uniform and how well dressed he was and everything. And when he came up here a couple years ago to visit me and to visit Chuck, it was kind of a shock because there's this man who always wore the suit, and suddenly he's in a Hawaiian print shirt and with a ponytail. So I think he was enjoying retirement. We always joked that he went from a lawyer to an amateur golfer. So that's what he did down in Florida for several years, up until he got sick. And it was very sudden. He got diagnosed in May, and he passed in November. So it was kind of it was tough, but at the same time, I think of it as kind of a blessing that he went fast, because you don't want people to suffer, so. But he fought, right up until the end, and that's who he was.
Anybody else like to speak on behalf of Ed Fagan? Elliot?
Yes.
It's all yours.
So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Elliot Ramondo. I'm part of the Bar Association, and I send out the Bar Association's emails sometimes. This message is not from me. I unfortunately did not know Ed when he was practicing. I've heard many things about him. He was, the character. That being said, this message is from Barb Widrig, who was unable to make it today. And she wanted the Bar Association to know that she expresses her deepest sympathy to Joanna and Christopher and other family members. She truly believes that Ed was one of the best trial lawyers in the region. He had a soft spot in his heart for the underdog, and he would put all of his effort into their legal representation. She specifically recalls one case in Warren, Pennsylvania. A young man charged with a felony assault was looking at prison time if found guilty. The young man claimed his innocence throughout the trial, claiming it was a case of mistaken identity. The case went to a jury trial, and thank goodness Ed was representing him. Do you know why? Because during that trial, the prosecution called a young man to the stand, and I couldn't believe my eyes. That witness resembled the defendant in so many ways. He looked exactly like the defendant. I'm convinced that due to Ed's representation, the jury acquitted the defendant. This is just one small example of his great legal career, and again, my deepest sympathies to the family. Barbara Widrig.
As a comment, though a non-litigator, I did have a chance to interface with Ed on many occasions, and also got to know Ed quite well through a series of interviews I have done with many of those in the audience, many of those who are there, on the lives and times of their law career. And all those lawyers seemingly interfaced with Ed, because there are stories about Ed throughout those interviews. And if you want good comedic comment and about Ed's ability to love to fight, his love to law, his love of his clients, they're there as proof positive of the Ed Fagan, the consummate lawyer who treated the law in his real domain. So with that, if there are no other comments, I'm going to call this meeting adjourned. We'll have the transcript prepared, and we'll send it off to the family. And thank you all for attending. Appreciate it.